Hi there. This is George R.R. Martin coming to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Thank you for listening to my podcast. I thought I would talk to you a little today about A Feast for Crows and the fantasy series that is part of A Song of Ice and Fire, which some of you may be reading and others hopefully will pick up on in the near future. I get asked all the time where this series came from. I've been writing it now for more than a decade, something like a decade and a half. But if truth be told, I didn't really intend to write it. It all began back in 1991, at which time I was mostly working for Hollywood. I spent 10 years out in Hollywood working in television and film, roughly from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s. But Hollywood work is not continuous. You get a job on a show, and it runs for a season, and it's canceled. You get a movie, you work on it for half a year, and then it's done. And so sometimes there are times between assignments. And in 1991, the summer of 1991, I was indeed between Hollywood assignments. And I thought I would get started on a novel. It had been 5 or 6 years since my last novel had come out. And I was anxious to keep my hand in as far as prose was concerned, because I began as a novelist and a short story writer. As much as I enjoyed working in television and film, books were my first love and are still my first love. So I wanted to continue to work in that field. And I had this science fiction novel called Avalon that I'd been thinking about for more than a decade. It was set in a future history that I had developed a lot in my short stories and novels way back in the 1970s, and I thought it would be a good continuation of that. And I had a lot of notes on it. I had the characters. I had some ideas for the plot. So I sat down in the summer of 1991. I began work on Avalon, and it was going pretty well. And then one day, this chapter came to me, this scene about a young boy going out with his father in the snows to see a man executed. And they find these direwolf pups. It was a medieval setting. I knew that. I knew it had a large cast of characters. And it seized hold of me, and I didn't know where it came from. I still don't know where it came from. But it came to me so vividly. I could see the scene. I could see the snow. I could feel the cold. I could see the blood when the sword took off the man's head, and feel the boy's feelings about this, because he was a young boy, and this was the first time his father had let him participate in this rite of adulthood and seeing an execution. So he was excited, but he was a little scared at the same time. And then the direwolf pups and the meaning of that, of course, became a major part of what he had to go through. Now, one thing I knew when this came to me is it wasn't part of Avalon. It had absolutely nothing to do with this science fiction novel that I was writing. But it was there, and it was so vivid that I knew I had to write it. So I put Avalon aside, and I wrote that chapter, which ultimately would become the first chapter of A Game of Thrones, which was, in turn, the first book of A Song of Ice and Fire. People sometimes say, this book wrote itself, this story wrote itself. I've never had the experience of anything writing itself. But every once in a while, you will come across a chapter that you just seem to know it so well that it just seems to flow out of your fingers onto the page. And that's what happened with this chapter. It only took me a few days to get it down. And by the time I did have it down, I knew the chapter that had to follow it, which would be from the viewpoint of a different person. So I went right on from that chapter to the next chapter. And before I knew it, I'd been working for several weeks on this new project, which at that stage didn't have a name yet. And it had nothing to do with Avalon. So the novel that I'd planned for so long went into the drawer where it has remained till this day. And instead I found myself writing this epic fantasy series. Although I didn't know it was a series at the time. In the beginning I thought maybe it was just a novella. But pretty soon I decided, no, given the number of characters and scales, it had to be a novel. And then I decided, well, maybe it was a trilogy. Maybe it was a series of novels. I knew I was really serious when I took time off and I drew a map of the world. Of course, I didn't finish it in 1991 because, as I said, I was on a break from Hollywood, and breaks from Hollywood didn't last. Toward the end of that summer, I had about 70 or 80 pages on the book, but my Hollywood agent called and said she had some meetings for me set up with the networks to pitch ideas for television shows, and that's not the sort of thing that you turn down if you're working in Hollywood. So I flew out and I pitched some ideas for television shows, and one of them was picked up. So the book that by then I was thinking of as Game of Thrones went in a drawer next to Avalon, and I took off a year and a half to write and then produce a pilot called Doorways for ABC. And then there were some other pilots. So it was a lot of time passed before I actually got back to the novel. Now, that's dangerous for me. In the past, when I've had a work in progress and I've put it aside for a significant period of time, sometimes it goes cold on me. And I come back to it, and I don't know who the characters are anymore. I don't know where I was going with the plot, and I have great difficulty getting back into it. But that never happened with Game of Thrones, even though something like 2-3 years passed before I could get back to it. All that time, while I was doing other things, while I was working in Hollywood, where I was writing movies, writing television pilots, producing those, the characters and the situations of A Game of Thrones continued to sort of haunt the back of my mind. Arya and Tyrion and Dany and Jon Snow and some of the other characters that I was so involved with who had come alive in this book. I would see scenes of them in my head. I would hear them talking to me when I was driving to and fro on the Los Angeles freeways. So finally, back in 1994, I believe it was, I finally took it out again and got back to work on it and gave it to my agents and said, let's see if anyone was interested in buying this. And fortunately, several people were interested in buying it, so next thing I knew, I had a deal, and I was finally able to step away from Hollywood. And to tell you the truth, I was getting pretty frustrated with Hollywood by that point in time, and work full-time on A Game of Thrones. And the rest, I guess, is history. The first book came out in 1996, and there have been 3 more since then. I'm now thinking to tell the entire story is going to require me 7 volumes, and 7 big volumes. Tolkien once said the tale grew in the telling when he was discussing Lord of the Rings, which of course had started out being just a simple little sequel to The Hobbit. And I know how he felt because that is exactly what happened with A Song of Ice and Fire. It's a big story, and it has grown in the telling. So A Feast for Crows is the 4th installment of that story, and I'm presently at work on the 5th part, A Dance with Dragons, which I hope to finish before the end of this year. But you'll have to watch my website to see how well I do with that. You can always get updates on my progress and everything else that's going on in my life by checking out www.georgerrmartin.com. And meanwhile, if you haven't read Ice and Fire yet and you're listening to this, I hope you'll give it a chance. The first book to start with is A Game of Thrones. The 4th book is A Feast for Crows, which is now on sale wherever books are sold. And thanks again for coming here and listening to my podcast. I'll look forward to talking to you again. Take care. Hi there. This is George R.R. Martin talking to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico, in another of these podcasts. You can always find out more about me and my books at my website, www.georgerrmartin.com, and I hope you'll check that out. Lots of stuff there besides talk about me and my books. I occasionally do other things besides write and read, so you'll also find a few things about the movies I'm seeing, some political thoughts, some complaints about life, all of that sort of stuff. I try to update my website as often as I can, and it's my little way of contacting the world. Today I thought I would talk to you a little about writing and how I got started as a writer, which is a question I get asked a lot when I go on tour and do conventions. When did you start to write, people say. The truth is I can hardly remember a time when I didn't write. I think I was writing almost from the time that I began to read. I'm kind of a pack rat, and I keep stuff for decades. I have a very hard time throwing anything away. So I actually still have some of the very earliest things I wrote when I was a kid, and it's like handwritten in block lettering in these those kind of school book tablets that they had at that time with sort of the marbled covers, black and white. And I would fill up those pages with like drawings of planets and an encyclopedia of space. I think that's the earliest thing I have that I wrote. I swear I couldn't have been more than like 5 or 6. I have all these drawings of planets, which are mostly just sort of a crude attempt to make a circle, colored one way or another with a crayon. And then beneath, hand block written, I've written something about that planet and who lives on it. All of my planets had people living on it. The empty planets would be very boring. And I look through this book now, my Encyclopedia of Space, my earliest surviving work, and it's interesting because things are completely mixed. I have like Mars and Venus in there, Saturn, real planets that I'd obviously read about in some textbook or seen on television, and they're mixed with fictional planets from the space shows of the time that I watched, Captain Video and Tom Corbett, Space Cadet, and Rocky Jones, Space Ranger, which was always my favorite. Rocky had the coolest spaceship, the Orbit Jet, much sexier looking than Tom Corbett's spaceship or Flash Gordon's spaceship. Not that I knew what sexy meant back then, but still, it was a cool-looking spaceship. And so I would take planets from those, and I would put them in with Mars and Venus as if they were the same, and write down whatever I'd learned in the show about those particular planets. I couldn't quite distinguish between fact and fiction back then. And then I would add planets that I'm looking at this, and I'm pretty sure that these are planets that I made up, that aren't from Rocky Jones, and of course aren't from the real solar system, that are just planets that I added. So I've always been writing, and I don't know where it comes from or what made me write, but it got to me at a very early age. Later on, growing up in the projects of Bayonne, New Jersey, I would actually write monster stories and sell them to the other kids in the neighborhood. I started out with just writing little one-page stories that I would sell for a penny, and they would be about a werewolf or a monster, Frankenstein, or the creature from the Black Lagoon, or some monster like that. And I would give a dramatic reading when I sold the story, because some of my customers actually didn't read very well. So not only would they buy the story, they'd have to read it to them. And I slowly escalated my prices, because even in those days, a penny couldn't buy you very much. I got my price all the way up to a nickel, which could buy a Milky Way bar. And the Milky Way bars I was very fond of. It was my favorite candy. So I'd write a story, read it, get a nickel, buy a Milky Way bar. It was a great system. But unfortunately, one of my customers started having nightmares about the monster stories I was reading to him. And his mother got very alarmed by the fact that he'd wake up in the middle of the night. And his mother went to my mother and said, "You have to stop George from scaring my kid." So my mother came down on me, and that was the end of my first abortive career as a professional writer, selling stories from Milky Way bars. Later on in high school, I continued to write. I was involved in comic fanzines. I loved comic books from an early age. Once again, sometimes I wonder if I would have become such a voracious reader if it hadn't been for comic books. Because I learned to read in school with Dick and Jane, who were like the most boring people in the universe. Baby boomers of my generation probably remember Dick and Jane and the really dull stories about run, Dick, run, see Spot run, little boats and suburban stuff, and it was very tedious. they were a boring family. But on the other hand, I had Batman and Superman and World's Finest Comics, and a little later on, Flash and the Marvel guys, and those were much more exciting things to read. So I got heavily into comic books. And in the '60s, comic fandom was just beginning. A bunch of fans started writing to each other from letters published in the letter columns of the fan magazines and they of the comic magazines rather, and they started issuing their little amateur magazines called fanzines. Most of which were produced on a mimeograph machine or by a process known as ditto, which involved a pan of gelatin and masters, and it came out in this faded purple type, but it was very cheap. It was something even a high school kid could do. And I was like a grade school kid initially and then a high school kid, so I would write up these amateur superhero stories and send them off to the fanzines, and they started publishing them. And, of course, they were pretty dreadful, childish stories, but in the context of the time, they were well received. And sometimes I think every beginning writer needs a place like that where the standards are not high initially, a place where you can be bad and not be hammered by it, and get a certain amount of affirmation and confidence, which I did get out of comics fandom. I continued to write for those comic fanzines and hopefully got better and better all the way through college. And finally, I reached a point where I thought, well, I'm going to try some stories on a professional magazines. And actually, the first story I ever submitted to a professional magazine, people asked me, well, what was your first submission, your first rejection? Was it, Analog? Was it Galaxy? Was it one of the great editors at the time, H.O. Gold or John W. Campbell? No, it was a magazine called American Scandinavian Review. Because I was taking a course in college in Scandinavian history, and I talked the professor into letting me write historical fiction instead of a term paper for my final grade. And I wrote a story about the Russo-Swedish War of 1808 that the professor liked so well that he submitted it for me to a professional publication, American Scandinavian Review. And they didn't buy it, but it was my first rejection slip. And I lived through that first rejection slip, which gave me confidence to start sending out some of my science fiction stories as well, because I had learned that rejection slips are not fatal, and indeed, the editor of American Scandinavian Review said a few nice things about the story when he sent it back. So I started submitting, and it was actually my graduate year of college that Galaxy magazine wrote back and said they were buying my story, The Hero. I got a check for $94, which actually was tremendous amount of money in those days, so I was very pleased to get it. The year was, that was the summer of 1970. The story came out in February of 1971, and I was officially a professional writer, so I came a long way from the Encyclopedia of Space to Galaxy, but it was a long, strange trip, but it's one I'm glad I took. Anyway, thanks for listening. This is George R. R. Martin, and please do check out my website at www.georgerrmartin.com. A Feast for Crows is now on sale wherever books are sold, as well as the earlier books in the series, so check those out as well. Take care. Hi there. This is George R. R. Martin talking to you from my home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Thanks for listening to my podcast. You can always find out more about me and my books by checking out my website at www.georgerrmartin.com. I thought I would say a few words today about writing and how you become a writer. I get a lot of email from aspiring writers. They've read my books. They're writing a book of their own. They want to write a book of their own. They dream of being a writer. And some of them want to send me their manuscripts to read. Some of them want to collaborate with me. I've tried to address this a little in the frequently asked questions section of my website, but let me go into it a little bit more on this podcast, and maybe it'll help, because I certainly sympathize with aspiring writers. I was one myself. We all start out that way, and it's a tough road. So what advice do I have for aspiring writers? Well, one thing I do is I quote the late, great Robert A. Heinlein, who had 4 rules for would-be writers, and I think they're well worth repeating. Heinlein's rules. Number one, you must write. Now, that seems obvious. Of course, if you want to be a writer, you must write. But actually, a lot of people who say they want to be writers never quite get around to writing. They talk about writing. Sometimes they even have very specific story ideas that they'll tell you about at a party. They'll tell you about it in the email. But they never actually sit their ass in a chair and write. And that's not a writer. That's a talker. If you want to be a writer, Heinlein is right. You have to write. His second rule, you must finish what you write. This is one I had trouble with myself. When I first started to write as a kid, I would begin a lot of stories, but I would never finish them. And indeed, I have a trunk somewhere around here where it's full of fragments that I wrote when I was in grade school and high school, very crude early stuff, but there's a lot of beginnings. And there's not so many middles, and there's almost no ends. And this is also something that a lot of writers run into. They start stories, and then they can't finish it. They're beginning one story, and then they get an idea for a new story, so they put the first story aside, and they're working on a new story, and then they get the idea for yet another story. No, that doesn't work. No one is buying fragments. No one is buying scenes or episodes. If you want to be a professional writer, if you want to actually write things that people are going to publish, you have to make yourself finish the stories that you're writing. A good story needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. Heinlein's third rule was that you must market what you write. You must, after you finish the story, you must start sending it out to editors. Once again, seems pretty obvious, but once again, a lot of people don't do it. You know, you hear people who have novels in trunks, who have short stories in a drawer, or who send it out one time and then stop sending it out because they get a rejection. Now, you have to send it out to an editor. And there are lots of things. You can pick up Writer's Market or Literary Marketplace. Any of the writers' magazines will tell you the rules for how you send it out, that it has to be a typed manuscript, double-spaced, nice paper, stamped self-addressed envelope, all of that stuff. I don't need to go into that. You can find that in any of these other sources. And then the fourth one is you must refrain from rewriting except on editorial order. Sometimes the writer will send out a story, and it'll come back with a rejection slip, and they'll say, well, it couldn't have been very good, so I'll rewrite it. And then they rewrite it, they send it out again, it comes back, they rewrite it again. That endless fiddling with the story is not going to get you anywhere. I mean, you finish the story, put it on the market. It comes back from one editor, put it in a new envelope, send it out to another editor, preferably the same day. That's what I did in college when I was first trying to seriously to sell my stories. I was sending them out continuously. I had some points I had 7, 8 stories out in the market at the same time. I couldn't even have told you where they were because it would come back from one magazine and I would send it out to the other magazine the same afternoon that it had come back. Now, sometimes you will get an actual letter from an editor instead of a form rejection slip, and the editor will say, I thought your story was very good, the writing was nice, except the ending really fell apart. I don't think the character should have committed suicide. So then you have a specific direction from an editor, and that's something you respond to. That's when you rewrite it, if you want to rewrite it and want to sell it, and you make it so that the character doesn't commit suicide. And then you send it back and say, thank you for your suggestions. I've rewritten it as you suggested. Maybe you'll like the new version better. And hopefully you'll get a sale out of that. So those are Heinlein's 4 rules. And I think they're 4 good rules that any aspiring writer would do well to follow. The other rule that I'll add here, which is in my frequently asked questions thing too, but let me stress it a little more, is if you're a young writer, a beginning writer, whatever age, start with short stories. We're lucky in science fiction and fantasy because we still have a viable short story market. And if you don't know about that market, you need to know about that market. So get yourself down to a newsstand and buy a copy of Asimov's science fiction, buy a copy of Analog, buy a copy of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, which is called FNSF, or Realms of Fantasy, or Weird Tales or any of the other magazines that are out there. We still have all these magazines, and these magazines, they don't pay much, but they are professional markets. They're always looking for new writers. That's because the big established writers are mostly writing novels, and they don't have time to do short stories. So the magazines, in order to fill their pages, and many of them come out every month, have to find a constant stream of new young writers, and their editors are always reading the unsolicited submissions, which are called the slush pile. They're always reading those, looking for a new talent, looking for a fresh voice, looking for something original and good, looking for someone else who will interest their readers and fill up their pages. That's the way to break in. There's much greater opportunity to break in with short stories than with novels. And also, of course, if you're a new writer, you're going to write some bad stories. You're going to experiment with techniques, and you should experiment with techniques because you have to learn to use your tools. But you're going to experiment with techniques, and they're not going to work. Well, if you write a bad short story, you've wasted a month at the most. If you write a bad novel, you may have wasted a year or 2 years or 3 years, depending on the length of that novel. I mean, I get letters from high school kids who tell me that they're working on an epic fantasy series like mine, 3 gigantic volumes of 1,000 pages each. Now, yes, occasionally there will be someone like that. There will be a 17-year-old writer who writes 3,000 pages of an epic fantasy novel, and he's unusually talented or unusually gifted or unusually lucky, and he manages to sell it. But the vast majority of people who are doing that are not going to succeed. Learn your craft first with the short stories. It also has the advantage that if you start selling those short stories and you go for 5 or 6 years, and you have short stories in all of the magazines, people are going to get to know your name. And then when you finally do write that novel, it's not going to be, oh, here's yet another novel by someone that we've never heard of. Why should I pick it up? It's going to be, oh, look, here's the long-awaited first novel by this rising young writer who we've seen in all of the magazines. And in today's very competitive market, that can make a huge difference for a young writer. And that was certainly the way I did it. My first story appeared in Galaxy in 1971. I won the Hugo in 1975 for a short story, a novella, actually. And my first novel did not come out until 1977. So it was definitely the long-awaited first novel by this Hugo-winning author, and it worked very well for me. It sold well, got well-reviewed, all of things that won't happen if you're a total unknown. So start with short stories and follow Heinlein's rules, and you'll give yourself the best possible chance to succeed as a writer. But the other thing I've got to add is keep your day job, too, because writing's a hard gig, and even some professional writers have a tough time making ends meet with it. So it's not wise to burn all your bridges there until you know that you're going to make it. I worked at many different jobs back in the 70s when I was first establishing myself as a writer. I was a college instructor. I ran chess tournaments. I was a Vista volunteer doing public relations and a little bit of journalism. Anything to pay my rent, pay the phone bill, pay for my typewriter ribbons, until finally my books were selling enough that I was able to move to Santa Fe and go full-time, which really didn't happen until 1980. I'd been a professional writer for 9 years. And good luck. You're going to need it. This is George R. Martin. Thank you for listening to my podcast. Do check out my website at www.georgerrmartin.com, and you can pick up A Feast for Crows, now on sale wherever books are sold. Hi there. This is George R. Martin. I'm talking to you from my home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where it's a lovely, cool day. Autumn is beginning a little early here, it seems, which is fine with me, because I have never liked it when it gets too hot. I suppose that's why when I think winter is coming, it's with a certain amount of enthusiasm. I like cold weather much better than I've ever liked hot weather. But today I thought I would talk to you a little bit about Hollywood. And I have to confess that for my sins, I spent 10 years out there. roughly from 1985 to 1995, working in television and film. That was not my intent, of course. As a kid, I watched television. I went to movies. I loved them, of course, especially science fiction, fantasy, what my father used to call weird stuff. Always liked the weird stuff. But I wrote prose. I wrote short stories. I wrote later novels. And at a certain point, I would have told you that was all I ever wanted. I'd heard all the horror stories about Hollywood that you hear from other writers. You go out there and they make you crazy, and it's endless rewriting, and et cetera, et cetera. So it was not something that I aspired to. I got involved in it almost by accident. It all began when I wrote a novel called The Armageddon Rag, which was actually about to come out again in a couple of months in a new trade paperback edition from Bantam Books. So if you're curious about The Armageddon Rag, you can pick it up shortly. But it was originally written in 1982. Up to that point, my career had been a pretty good one. I published short stories. I'd won awards. I'd started writing novels. They were well received. Each novel sold better and got a larger advance than the one before. And The Armageddon Rag, which was a bit of a departure for me because it was a novel about the 60s and rock and roll and the counterculture. It did have a dark fantasy element. It was sort of partly a murder mystery and partly a mainstream novel and partly a horror, dark fantasy sort of novel, all of these genres mixed together. But I tend to think of it mostly as my 60s novel, because I was a child of the 60s, a baby boomer who came of age during that, what is now referred to as tumultuous decade. And I think it had an impression on all of us, certainly did on me. The Armageddon Rag was, I think, a good book, and if you go out and buy it, you'll be able to make that judgment for yourself. But it was very nicely reviewed. It was nominated for the World Fantasy Award. But the problem was that no one bought it. There was a convention in publishing, a common conventional wisdom in publishing. The conventional wisdom in publishing was that rock and roll novels don't sell. On the theory that people who want to read about rock and roll, they want to read about real bands like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or the Beach Boys. They don't want to read about fictional made-up bands. They want to read about Jim Morrison or Elvis or real singers. They don't want to read about characters that some writer has created. But I didn't know that conventional wisdom when I began the book, and my editor, who did know it, decided that this would be the book that would be the exception. It wasn't the book that was the exception. It was indeed prove the rule, and it sold very badly. And of course, in publishing, you're only as good as your last book. So suddenly, around the mid-'80s, I found myself unable to sell my next novel because the Armageddon Rag had sold so poorly. But oddly enough, and sometimes it makes me think there is guardian angels watching over all of us, the very book that threw a monkey wrench into my career as a novelist opened the door to Hollywood, because even though it sold poorly, the Armageddon Rag was optioned for a feature film by a writer-producer by the name of Phil DeGuerre, who mostly worked in television. Phil had worked on a number of shows as a writer and then as a producer, and he had created his own hit show called Simon and Simon. And he was a big fan of the Grateful Dead, a big fan of rock and roll, and we shared an agent, and he loved the Armageddon Rag when it was sent to him. So he optioned it, and he wrote some screenplays. He wanted to make it as a feature film. And he actually flew me out to Hollywood to discuss it with him. So we spent a couple days together talking about what should be in the film script, and got to know each other a little. Well, Phil did write a script, but the film was never made, as many films are not made out there. But because we'd gotten to know each other, a couple years later, Phil revived The Twilight Zone, which oddly enough had been my favorite show as a kid. I mean, when I was in 7th and 8th grade, I watched The Twilight Zone religiously every week to see what Rod Serling and Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont would come up with. It was the best show on television as far as I was concerned. And here we were, 20 years later, Twilight Zone was coming back, and Phil offered me the chance to write for it. So oddly enough, the first script I actually wrote for him was a rewrite of a script about a Elvis impersonator. So it had the rock and roll tie-in, and he thought because of the Armageddon rag, I'd be well suited for it. And they liked the script that I did well enough, so suddenly Phil said, well, why don't you come out to Hollywood and we'll put you on staff as a staff writer. And since I couldn't sell a novel at the time because of the Armageddon rag selling so badly in the bookstores, I leapt at the offer, and next thing I knew, I was out in Hollywood. I wound up doing 5 episodes for The Twilight Zone. I managed to advance from staff writer, which staff writer is the lowest position you can have as a writer in Hollywood is freelancer, where you're not employed by anyone. You're just trying to sell a script here, a script there. But once you get past a freelancer, the lowest staff job you can possibly have is staff writer. And you know it's a low job because it's the only job that actually has the word writer in the title. Writers are not greatly esteemed in Hollywood, although they're more esteemed in television and in film. But I advanced I was staff writer to begin with, and then I became story editor, an executive story editor. And then when Twilight Zone was canceled, suddenly I had all these credentials. I kind of, when I was out there working on Twilight Zone, I sort of thought, well, this is an unusual thing. This is an anthology show, and I'm adapting classic science fiction short stories, and I'm writing a few original things, but it's a one-time thing. I'm not really a television writer. But then suddenly Twilight Zone was canceled, and I'm getting other television offers. So I wound up writing a couple of scripts for Max Headroom, which were not produced. And then the next thing I know, my scripts had been sent to another writer-producer by the name of Ron Koslow, who had just created a pilot for a new show called Beauty and the Beast. And Ron liked my Twilight Zone scripts, and when Beauty and the Beast was picked up to go to series, he hired me to come on board as part of his staff. So I worked for Beauty and the Beast for 3 years, and wound up doing 13 episodes of that show. And by the end of it, I was the supervising producer on the show, which is almost as high as you can get. Only executive producer is a higher title in the world of television. So the next step really was for me to create my own show. Twilight Zone and Beauty and the Beast, between them, were the first 5 years of my 10 years in Hollywood. The second 5 years, having sort of climbed the Hollywood ladder, I was doing what they call development. I was coming up with pilot ideas for my own shows, pitching them to networks. Sometimes they would buy a pilot, I would write a script, then have to wait around to see if they were going to greenlight the script and let me actually shoot it. Of course, then you shoot the pilot and you wait to see if the show gets on the air. I was also doing a lot of movie work, feature films. You haven't seen any of my feature films, and you haven't seen any of my television shows. Only one of my pilots was ever produced, and none of the feature films were ever produced, which ultimately is why I'm not in Hollywood now. You know, it's very lucrative in Hollywood. Television, film, they'll give you dump trucks full of money. And a lot of writers are content with that. They'll sit out there around their kidney-shaped swimming pools, sipping their drinks with their trophy wives, and they've never had anything produced, but they make a lot of money from writing and rewriting and rewriting. But it took me 5 years, but finally I figured out that this was not for me. I mean, I really need an audience. Even when I was a kid, as I've talked about in one of the podcasts, you know, selling my first stories to the other kids in the projects for a nickel so I could buy a Milky Way bar, I read those stories to the kids, and I wanted to see what they thought of these stories that they'd come up with. Now, when I worked on Beauty and the Beast and Twilight Zone, yeah, that was stressful. There were fights. There were arguments with the network, arguments with the studio, arguments with the other writers and producers on the show. Sometimes the actors were trouble. There were frustrations, but there was also great rewards. I was working with some great people, some wonderful other writers like Alan Brennert on the Twilight Zone, Rockne O'Bannon also on the Twilight Zone, Howard Gordon, Alex Gansa on Beauty and the Beast. Terrific staffs of other writers, and on B&B I had some great actors to write for, people like Ron Perlman and Roy Dotrice, Linda Hamilton. So it was great to see that. And everything I wrote, no matter how stressful and how many fights we had and what problems we had to overcome, sooner or later we had to film a show because we had a show to put on Friday. So sooner or later the script went before the camera and a show came out and it went on the air and millions of people saw it. And that ultimately was more rewarding for me than even the large dump trucks full of money. The second 5 years, however, when I was in development, I worked for a year on a project, and then for one reason or another, they decided not to proceed with it. They've got something similar. Some other studio has something similar. There's only room for one science fiction show on the schedule, so even though they like yours, they're not going to put it on. I encountered all of this stuff, and ultimately it drove me crazy. I want an audience. I'm not going to write for four guys in the room, no matter how much money they give me. So after I fulfilled the last of my movie contracts out there, I came back to Santa Fe and back to A Song of Ice and Fire, which I had actually begun in 1991 in sort of a lapse between two Hollywood projects, but had never been able to forget. And I returned not only to the world of New Mexico, but to the world of Westeros, and I've been living there pretty happily ever since. People ask me if I liked my Hollywood experience, if I loved Hollywood, if I hated Hollywood. It's a little bit of both. I certainly hated Los Angeles, which is sort of a ghastly city, but there are some good friends there, some good restaurants there. I enjoy visiting, but I didn't like living there, especially when I had to drive on the freeways. I like Santa Fe a lot more. And I like being able to write for readers and not for focus groups or Nielsen families or four guys in an office. So will I ever work for Hollywood again? Maybe if the right project comes along, but certainly not for a while. I've got this story to finish first, A Song of Ice and Fire. I still have 3 books to go on that one, and I have other books and novels that I want to tell beyond that. So I think that's likely to keep me busy for a while. And that's the latest from Santa Fe and George R.R. Martin. Do visit my website at www.georgerrmartin.com. And A Feast for Crows is now on sale wherever books are sold. So do go forth and pick up a copy. Thanks for listening. Hello there. This is George R.R. Martin. I'm talking to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico, my home, my office. Taking a break from working on A Dance with Dragons today to do another of these podcasts. Thank you for listening. Please do check out my website, www.georgerrmartin.com. You'll find the latest news about how A Dance with Dragons is going there, and lots of other stuff about myself and what I'm reading, what I'm watching, what I'm doing when I'm not chained to this computer writing away. I wanted to talk today a little about my fans and fans in general. And I suppose I should begin that with a confession, is I am a fan. I started as a fan. A lot of writers start as fans. And I'm still a fan, which a lot of writers might not necessarily say, but it's certainly something that I feel. Now, when I use the word fan, I don't just mean a reader. I mean someone who's part of science fiction fandom, which is sort of a semi-organized, if you can call it organized. The organization is sometimes rather ad hoc and chaotic, but there is some semblance of an organization there. A semi-organized fandom community that holds conventions all around the United States, indeed all around the world, and publishes amateur magazines called fanzines. And these days in the internet, there are millions of fan blogs up there. So it's not it's distinct from a reader. A reader is someone who, picks up your book and reads it. But fans go beyond that. Fans are very much involved in all of this stuff. And I've been a fan almost since the beginning. When I was a kid, I had a letter published in Fantastic Four. I think it was issue number 17. Probably my first published words in professional print was in a letter column of Fantastic Four number 17, and I think I said something like, Shakespeare better move over, Stan Lee is here now, and boy, isn't he great. So they published that, and you can find it if you have the $12,000 or whatever Fantastic Four number 17 would cost. When it first came out, it cost 12 cents, but that was a long time ago. In those days, when they published your letter in a comic letter column, it had your whole address right under your letter. So a short time after that letter came out, I started getting letters from other comic fans who had seen my address there and were writing me to say, well, they like the Fantastic Four too. And by the way, they were publishing this fanzine that talked about the Fantastic Four, and maybe I'd like to buy a copy. And indeed, I did. So I sent off a quarter. We called them sticky quarters in those days. A lot of the fanzines cost a quarter. But you didn't want to send a quarter in an envelope because it will bounce around. So you put in an index card and you scotch taped it so the quarter would stick. And when they pulled it off, the scotch tape left a residue on it. So you bought the fanzines with the sticky quarters. And I was a high school kid. The fanzines were mostly put out by high school kids. And they were produced on mimeograph machines, a few of them on the very early Xerox machines, a lot of them by a method called Ditto, which is now thankfully largely forgotten and involved gelatin trays and fluids and produced this kind of purple type that began to fade almost as soon as it rolled off the press. And you could make, 20, 30 copies with a Ditto machine before it faded to illegibility, and you had to retype the master. I never published a fanzine, but I did write for a lot of fanzines, because one thing I discovered is that these fanzines were being written by other kids like me, so if they could write things, I could write things too. So I started sending off articles, I started sending off letters to the letter columns in the fanzines, I started sending off my first published stories, which featured characters like Manta Ray and Garazan, the Mechanical Warrior, and the White Raider, who was a superhero on skis with flamethrowers in his ski poles. This was some of my earliest stuff, all mercifully long forgotten. Although sometimes you can go on eBay and find those fanzines, which originally sold for a sticky quarter, now going for a couple $100. So there you are. I guess everything gets more valuable as after a few decades has passed. Comic fandom was an offshoot of science fiction fandom, which was much older and had actually begun in the 1930s and had begun much the same way, with fans writing to each other when they saw their names and addresses printed in the letter columns of the science fiction magazines of that day. But by the 1960s, comic fandom was really spinning off from science fiction fandom. And it was actually, I believe, in 1963 that comic fans had their first convention. And I was the first person to sign up for that convention. It was held in Greenwich Village. I lived in Bayonne, New Jersey. So I took the bus over to New York, which was a kind of scary thing for a kid to do at that time, and wandered around Greenwich Village till I found a hotel. And they just had like one room in the hotel. And I went up there, and there were about 20 of us there. Len Wein was one of the guys running it. He would later go be the editor of DC Comics, of Marvel Comics, of Disney Comics, one of the major figures in the world of comic books. But at that time, he was just a high school kid running this convention. The big star was Steve Ditko, who was doing Spider-Man at the time. So I was like the first comic fan at the first comic convention. I won a page of original art. I was very proud of, and it was an exciting time. So I think comic fandom set the hook. It was years later, it was in 1971, that I went to my first actual science fiction convention. By that time, I'd actually sold a science fiction story. My first story had sold and had appeared in Galaxy when I attended a convention in Washington, D.C. So I was, at conventions they talk about fans and pros. I was a pro from the minute that I walked into the convention. But I was still a fan, too. And there were editors there were writers there who I'd been reading for years. There were new writers who I hadn't read, but who were of my same age, and who I enjoyed hanging around with them and having a few beers with them. And I've had other fans tell me that when they went to their first convention, there was this feeling, my God, I found my people at last. And I can certainly sympathize with that because to a certain extent that was what I found, both in 63 at the comic convention and in 71 at the science fiction convention. And I've been going to science fiction conventions continuously since 1971. I usually do about half a dozen a year. Now, these days, with Ice and Fire so popular, a lot of people come to my signings. I have hundreds of people at my signings, and that's very gratifying. And they come up to me. Some want their pictures taken with me. Of course, I autograph their books for them, and I can tell that some of them would like to talk to me a little more. But at a signing, there's no time for talking because you got a minute or two with the author. He's just been talking to 100 people before you. There's still another 200 people in line. It's very difficult to have more than a snatched instant with anyone at a convention or at an autograph party. If you really would like to meet the people that you're reading and have a drink with them, talk to them a little, get to know them as human beings, what you want to do is go to a science fiction convention because not all of the writers attend them, but many of the writers attend them, and that's the place where you can buy the writer a drink or let him buy you a drink, where you can maybe sit down with him, where you can hear him give a reading from his work, where you can hear him do a panel discussion, as we can see your favorite writers arguing with each other over some point of literary technique or politics or what have you. They're wonderful social events for people who have the shared common interest in science fiction and fantasy. And you can go on my website, www.georgerrmartin.com, and if you click on the shield for appearances, you'll see all the conventions that I'm booked to go to and attend in 2006, 2007, 2008. I'm already booking things for 2009. And attend one of those if you want to meet me. I'll be glad to sign your books. I'll be glad to talk to you. I've also, in recent years, been very lucky because there's a wonderful group of folks called the Brotherhood Without Banners, who are big fans of the Ice and Fire series, and they've formed this group. They have a website as well, which you can find a link to if you go to my own website. Just check out on the links page, and they have parties at many of these conventions, so you can meet other fans of the Ice and Fire series and socialize with them and talk about the books or not talk about the books or talk about your other favorite writers. They're a terrific bunch. I often say that I have the best fans in the world, and I really think that's true. They've been wonderfully supportive of me, and I like hanging around with them, and I think you will too. So, yes, I'm a professional writer, and I'm proud of that, but part of me is always going to be a fan, just like that kid who took the bus over to New York City and went into that very first comic book convention to meet Steve Ditko. And I expect I'll be hanging around conventions until the day I die. So see you at one, I hope. And meanwhile, check out my website, www.georgerrmartin.com, and do go down to your nearest bookstore where my newest book, A Feast for Crows, should be now on sale. Thanks for listening. Take care. Hi there. This is George R. Martin. Thanks for joining my podcast. I'm speaking to you from my office in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where fall is just upon us, and NFL football is starting, which is always very exciting for me because I'm a huge football fan. Being born and raised in Bayonne, New Jersey, I'm a fan of the New York Giants and the New York Jets, both teams. I'm old enough so that they were in completely different leagues when I started, and there was never any danger of them playing each other. That's not true anymore, but I still like them both. And hopefully, my dream is to someday live long enough to see a Subway Super Bowl. But the The way things are going these days, who knows? But I don't really want to talk to you about football today. I want to talk to you about weird stuff. Science fiction, fantasy, horror. These are three different genres today. Science fiction and fantasy are still frequently bracketed together. You'll find them on the shelves, mingling with each other in most bookstores, but not all bookstores. Some bookstores have fantasy in a separate section from science fiction. And horror, monster stories, we called it when I was a kid, it's almost always off in another section of the bookstore. Of course, some of these books are up front in bestsellers. One of the things I get asked is why I write in all of these genres, and I have written in all of these genres. If you look at my novels, Dying of the Light, my first novel was a science fiction, a far future science fiction novel on an alien planet. Windhaven, which I wrote with Lisa Tuttle, was also science fiction on an alien planet. But my third novel, Fever Dream, was a historical horror novel set on the Mississippi River during the antebellum steamboat era. I got the idea for it when I was living in Dubuque, Iowa, and fell in love with the history of that town and the history of the Mississippi and the great steamboats that once plied it. And it's a vampire novel. There was a dark romanticism, two vampires that seemed to fit very well with that era and with steamboats. So it was a bit of a departure for me. And I remember when it came out, a lot of reviewers said, "Oh, George R. R. Martin has left science fiction and he's now writing horror." I hadn't left science fiction. I was just writing the story I wanted to write at that time. The book I wrote after that, The Armageddon Rag, that was even more of a departure. That was a contemporary novel. It did have a dark fantasy element. It also had like a murder mystery element. It kind of straddled 3 or 4 different genres. Then I wrote Tough Voyaging, which was, a science fiction book about an interstellar voyager named Haviland Tuff, who was the last of the ecological engineers moving from planet to planet, solving their ecological problems, or in some cases making their ecological problems, remaking their societies. Tuff had been the hero of a whole series of stories I'd written for Analog and Galaxy back in the 70s, and I put them all together and wrote a few new ones to make Tough Voyaging in the mid-'80s. And then, in the 90s, I started publishing A Song of Ice and Fire, which initially began with a Game of Thrones, was the first book. And now the fourth book, A Feast for Crows, is just about to be released in paperback, and you can find that at your nearest bookstore. And once again, some of my reviews said the same thing that they had about Fever Dream in 1982. Well, George R. R. Martin has left horror, and now he's writing epic fantasy. And once again, it drove me a little crazy because I hadn't left anything. You have to go back, I think, to when I was growing up in Bayonne, New Jersey. I mean, I think any writer, we write what we read. The things we love to read, especially when we're young, are the things that we're going to write later on, and that's certainly been true for me. And what did I read? Well, I read science fiction. I read Robert A. Heinlein was the first science fiction book I read, Half Spacesuit Will Travel. A friend of my mother's gave it to me, and God, that book blew me away. It's still the best of the Heinlein juveniles, and if you haven't read How Spacesuit Will Travel, you should go out and get it right now, because it's an incredible book. And then, of course, I went on to read all of Heinlein. I also read Andre Norton, Eric Frank Russell, Isaac Asimov, Jack Vance, all of the great science fiction writers of that time, mostly picking them up in the old Ace Doubles, which gave you 2 novels for 35 cents, had 2 covers on opposite sides. That was the main part of my collection back then. However, I also read H.P. Lovecraft. I remember discovering Lovecraft, and boy, he scared the hell out of me. And I love a scary story. I love a monster story. We didn't call it horror when we were kids. We called them monster movies, monster stories. And Lovecraft's nameless horrors were somehow much more frightening than any monster that could be described more specifically. And he really did evoke a sense of primal terror. I couldn't get enough of Lovecraft's work. And I read fantasy, too. I read Robert E. Howard initially. Conan the Barbarian, and his other heroes, King Kull, and Solomon Kane, who was actually probably my favorite, the Puritan adventurer. And then I discovered Tolkien. It was actually through a fanzine called Cortana that I first heard about Tolkien. It was a fanzine for fans of sword and sorcery fiction. And I was that because I was reading Conan, and I was reading Elric, and I was reading some of the other heroes. And it talked about this book called Lord of the Rings by this British writer. And sounded sort of interesting, and I picked it up. And at first I didn't know what to make of it. There were these little guys with hairy feet, and there was a birthday party, and there was a lot about pipeweed. I said, "Where's Conan the Barbarian here? Where's the sword slinging? Where's the fights?" I almost gave it up, especially when I hit Tom Bombadil, and people started saying, "Oh, Tom Bombadillo, oh." I said, "No, this is not for me." But somehow I kept going on, and things got more interesting after that. We got to Weathertop, we got to the Council of Elrond, the Black Riders were coming in. And really, by the time they got to the Mines of Moria, I was convinced that this was the greatest book I'd ever read. So I read all this stuff as a kid. My father called it weird stuff. My father didn't differentiate between science fiction on one hand and fantasy on another, and neither did the writers at the time. Writers like Poul Anderson, writers like Fritz Leiber, Jack Vance, they would write science fiction in one novel, and the next book would be fantasy, the next book would be horror. They moved freely between these genres, and that's pretty much what I've done. It's rare today, though. I mean, I think for whatever reasons, publishing has moved much more in the direction of a strong marketing identification. So if you're identified as a science fiction writer with your first book, they don't want you writing fantasy with the second book, and you come under a certain amount of pressure to maybe even come up with a pen name. So you have one name for your science fiction, one name for your fantasy. And a lot of people don't desire to write both. But, I do. I like weird stuff. I like weird stuff in all of its flavors. I don't agree with those who will tell you, and there are some, that there are fundamental differences between science fiction and fantasy, that they represent two opposite ends of some pole between rationality and faith. Frankly, I think that's nonsense. Yes, there are differences between them, but the differences are largely about the furniture. You have elves in one, aliens in another, but in a certain extent, the elf and the alien and the monster, if you want to bring in horror, they represent the outsider. Their metaphorical function, their function as a fictional trope is more or less the same. It's all in a matter of the handling. It's all the furniture. It's all the flavor. They're all ice cream. Some of them are pistachio and some of them are tutti frutti. And some days I want pistachio and some days I want tutti frutti, so that's fine with me. Song of Ice and Fire is a huge project. It's probably the project that I will be remembered for, if I am indeed remembered. It's already taken a decade of my life, and I got 3 more books to read, so it's going to take a lot longer. But if I do live to a ripe old age, as I hope I do, knock wood, I don't know that my next book will be fantasy. It might be science fiction. It might be horror. It might be something that I've never written before, like a murder mystery, a straight mainstream novel. Who knows what it will be? I like to try new things. I like to stretch my muscles. I think that's the only way you can kind of keep interested as a writer, that you can keep growing and hopefully improving, which is what all of us want to do. So it's all weird stuff, as my father used to say, and that's fine, because that's what I like. I like weird stuff, and hopefully you do too. Thanks for listening to me. Please do go visit my website at www.georgerrmartin.com and go to your favorite local bookstore and pick up A Feast for Crows, the 4th volume in my series, A Song of Ice and Fire, which is now on sale. Take care. Hi there. This is George R.R. Martin, back again with another podcast. The 4th novel in my fantasy series, A Song of Ice and Fire, is about to hit the bookstores near you in paperback. A Feast for Crows is the title. And I thought today I would read to you a little from it and talk about the book. This is from the prologue for A Feast for Crows, which is the fourth volume in A Song of Ice and Fire. "Dragons," said Molander. He snatched a withered apple off the ground and tossed it hand to hand. "Throw the apple," urged Alaris the Sphinx. He slipped an arrow from his quiver and knocked it to his bowstring. "I should like to see a dragon." Rune was the youngest of them, a chunky boy still 2 years shy of manhood. "I should like that very much." "And I should like to sleep with Rosie's arms around me," Pate thought. He shifted restlessly on the bench. By the morrow, the girl could well be his. I will take her far from Old Town, across the narrow sea to one of the free cities. There were no maesters there, no one to accuse him. He could hear Emma's laughter coming through a shuttered window overhead, mingled with the deeper voice of the man she was entertaining. She was the oldest of the serving wenches at the Quill and Tankard, 40 if she was a day, but still pretty in a fleshy sort of way. Rosie was her daughter, 15 and freshly flowered. Emma had decreed that Rosie's maidenhead would cost a golden dragon. Pate had saved 9 silver stags and a pot of copper stars and pennies, for all the good that would do him. He would have stood a better chance of hatching a real dragon than saving up enough coin to make a golden one. "You were born too late for dragons, lad," Armin the Acolyte told Rune. Armin wore a leather thong about his neck, strung with links of pewter, tin, lead, and copper. And like most acolytes, he seemed to believe that novices had turnips growing from their shoulders in place of heads. The last one perished during the reign of King Aegon III. "The last dragon in Westeros," insisted Molander. "Throw the apple," Alaris urged again. He was a comely youth, their sphinx. All the serving wenches doted on him. Even Rosie would sometimes touch him on the arm when she brought him wine, and Pate had to gnash his teeth and pretend not to see. "The last dragon in Westeros was the last dragon," said Armin doggedly. "That is well known." "The apple," Alaris said, "unless you mean to eat it." "Here." Dragging his clubfoot, Molander took a short hop, whirled, and whipped the apple's sidearm into the mist that hung above the honey wine. If not for his foot, he would have been a knight like his father. He had the strength for it in those thick arms and broad shoulders. Far and fast the apple flew, but not as fast as the arrow that whistled after it, a yard-long shaft of golden wood fletched with scarlet feathers. Pate did not see the arrow catch the apple, but he heard it. A soft chunk echoed back across the river, followed by a splash. Molander whistled. "You caught it. Sweet. Not half as sweet as Rosie." Pate loved her hazel eyes and the way she smiled every time she saw him. He loved the dimples in her cheeks. Sometimes she went barefoot as she served to feel the grass beneath her feet. He loved that, too. He loved the clean, fresh smell of her, the way her hair curled beneath her ears. He even loved her toes. One night she'd let him rub her feet and play with them, and he'd made up a funny tale for every toe to keep her giggling. Perhaps he would do better to remain on this side of the narrow sea. He could buy a donkey with the coin he'd saved, and he and Rosie could take turns riding it as they wandered Westeros. Ibrose might not think him worthy of the silver, but Pate knew how to set a bone and leech a fever. The small folk would be grateful for his help. If he could learn to cut hair and shave beards, he might even be a barber. That would be enough, he told himself, so long as I had Rosie. Rosie was all that mattered in the world. Well, that's the beginning of the prologue of A Feast for Crows. Just to give you a little taste of it. It's the first part you'll read when you open the book, but it was not the first part I wrote. It was not even close to being the first part I finished. And indeed, it took 5 years to write A Feast for Crows, by far the longest of any volume of A Song of Ice and Fire. It was the most difficult volume for me, and this chapter was a great part of that difficulty. Sometimes I think I spent a year just on this prologue, writing and rewriting it. You'll see from the samples that the prologue is from the viewpoint of a character named Pate. I actually wrote it from several other viewpoints at various points. Pate had a different name in the earliest take, and then I decided it shouldn't be Paint, it should be Molander, and then I decided no, it shouldn't be Molander, it should be Rosie, the serving wench. So I wrote a version that had her in it, seeing these characters from the outside. And for a while I thought that was working, and then I decided no, that wasn't working at all. So I went back to Paint. It's a tricky chapter in some ways, because the prologues in all of the Ice and Fire books introduce viewpoint characters who are not part of the continuing cast of characters. So you're hearing from a new voice in each of the prologues, someone you haven't met before, and you have to introduce that character. Some of the other prologues, though, even though the viewpoint character is new, he's in a familiar setting. He's surrounded by characters who are already established. That wasn't true in this case. This prologue is set in Old Town, where the citadel of Old Town, where the maesters are trained, is established, and all of the characters there are either novices or acolytes at the citadel, studying to earn their chains. I had never set a chapter at Old Town before. I had established very little about Old Town, so there was a lot to do in this chapter. I had to establish the city. I had to establish the citadel. I had to establish where they were, this tavern. It's a brand new location. To give Old Town a flavor all its own, unique from King's Landing or Winterfell or the cities of the East that Danny has been traveling through. And I had to introduce not only the new viewpoint character in Pate, but the people surrounding him, Molander and Alaris the Sphinx and Armin the Acolyte. And later, Lazy Leo Tyrell comes in, yet another character who's important. So there was a great deal to establish. At the same time, the first word of that, you'll notice, is dragons. That was a very deliberate choice, because one of the main functions of this chapter is to establish that the news of Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons has finally reached Westeros, has finally reached Old Town by sea, and therefore presumably either has also reached other parts of Westeros or is soon to reach other parts of Westeros. So that thread of the novels has always been separate until now. And now the threads are beginning to come together, and the dragons are going to loom up in greater importance. There's one thing you'll notice. This is the first thing, as I said, that you'll read when you read A Feast for Crows. You'll notice that one thing that you won't read is a big segment that says what has gone before, a summary of the first 3 volumes. And I occasionally get fan mail from my readers saying, I've forgotten who all your characters are. There's so many of them. I've forgotten the plots. It's so complicated. It has been 5 years before books. Can't you please include a summary? And I sympathize with those readers because I understand why they might forget. Sometimes I forget myself, and I have to look things up or rack my brain, and sometimes I make mistakes, which hopefully one of my editors will correct before it sees print. There is indeed a lot to remember, but nonetheless, I do not include a summary, and I don't want to include a summary, and I'm not going to include a summary, and there's some very conscious reasons for that. There are some mysteries in these books. There are some things that I'm going to reveal later on that I'm planting clues for. There are some later plot twists that I'm foreshadowing. There are things that are going to happen in Book 5 and Book 6 and Book 7 where I planted a seed for it in Book 1, but I don't necessarily want to give away my hand. So what do I do when I plant the seed? Well, I plant the seed, but I try to do a little literary sleight of hand. And while I'm planting the seed, my other hand is up there waving and is distracting you with some flashy bit of wordplay or something that's going on in the foreground while the seed is being planted in the background. So hopefully the seed is there, the foreshadowing is there, but maybe you won't notice it because it's surrounded by so many other things. So given that technique, what happens when I do a summary? Well, do I include the seed? Do I include the clues? Do I include the little bits of foreshadowing? If I leave them out, it's kind of cheating, because I'm supposed to be summarizing everything that's important, and yet I've left out these things that were important. So that's no good. I can't do it that way. But if I put them in the summary, then I lose, I think, a great deal of hope of surprising my readers and delighting them, hopefully later on, with some plot twist or some revelation. Because once stripped of all its disguise, once stripped of everything else that's going on, and not being buried among 1,000 pages, but being there in like a 5-page summary, the clue or the hint or the foreshadowing is much more prominent, and people are going to see it. So there's no good way, in my mind, to write those sorts of summaries. So I do not do and do not want to do and will not be doing what has gone before in any of these books. And I'm sorry about that if that means some readers have a hard time following. My suggestion is to reread, of course. I'm always delighted when I get letters from my readers who said, I went back and reread the first 3 books before I started the 4th book. And I noticed all sorts of things that I never noticed on the first read of the books. That's very gratifying for a writer, because I do take a lot of care with these things, and I put a lot of things in. And hopefully the story, the tapestry that I'm weaving, the thing that I'm building here is rich enough and complicated enough that it will reward a rereading, and that the second reading will be just as entertaining and just as much fun as the first reading, although different. I mean, when you read a book through for the first time, you're reading primarily for plot and to find out what's going to happen next, and that's what keeps you turning the pages. When you reread, you already know what's going to happen next because you've read it already, and then you can maybe appreciate other aspects, the prose, those little bits of foreshadowing, little clues that you didn't notice the first time because you were in such a hurry to turn the page and find out what happens next. So all of this goes into my thinking when I'm working on these things, and I do like to hear that people have not only read and enjoyed my books, but that they've reread them with pleasure. I think the best books are those that hold up to repeated rereading. I myself have read Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion more times than I can count, and every time I read it, I still enjoy it. And to my mind, that makes it a greater work than the books that I've read once and perhaps enjoyed, but yet have never gone back to for a second taste. Of course, since I don't use these summaries, these what have gone before things, that does somewhat impact the writing of it, because what I do try to do, I do have some mercy on my readers here. I don't want to make it too difficult for them. So what I do try to do in some of the early chapters of the book is to catch you up on where I left the character in the last book. So in A Feast for Crows, or any of the earlier books, or the books to come, usually the first chapter of a new character, the first Jon Snow chapter in the book, will have a lot of scene setting in it, because I'll be reminding you of where Jon Snow is and what he was doing last, the last things that happened to him in the book. Dany or Arya or any of the characters. So people have said to me, well, sometimes the books start slow, and of course they're intended to start slowly. Then, you set the scene first, the action begins. I do try to have something happening in every chapter, but then the action accelerates and eventually comes to a climax. This is the whole question of the structure of a book, or indeed of any work of art. And it's certainly the way I prefer to structure a book, and the way I think many writers do. It's not, of course, universal. You can go to a movie, for example, and you see one of these movies is nonstop action. I don't actually like movies that are nonstop action. I like pauses in the action to set the scene and build the suspense for the next bit of action. And then you have a period of frenetic action, violence, conflicts, climax. And then you have the anticlimax and the development and the scene setting and the build toward the next thing. I suppose it's the difference between a football game and a basketball game. I've had friends who are basketball fans tell me that they like basketball because the action is continuous. On football, there's a play, and then the play stops, and there's a huddle, and they prepare it, and there's another play, etc. But I prefer football. I like those pauses in the action that serve to build the suspense for the next one. With basketball or some of the continuous action sports, which I'm not a fan of, the action is going past too quickly. There are great athletic events going on, but there's not the same building of suspense that you get in a great football game or in a baseball game. And those are my two favorite sports. So this is the literature as a football game analogy, I guess, which might be a little strained, but does give you a certain idea of my philosophies on that. And there's a sample of A Feast for Crows. I hope you'll go out and buy it. It's the fourth volume of A Song of Ice and Fire, on sale at a bookstore near you. If you've not read the series so far, though, you don't want to start with A Feast for Crows. Go back and get the first book of the series, which is called The Game of Thrones. And if you'd like to learn a little more about me, be sure to check out my website, www.georgerrmartin.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Take care. Hi there. This is George R. Martin. Thanks for listening to my podcast. I'm talking to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I'm taking a break from writing A Dance with Dragons to record some of these thoughts. And today, I thought I'd talk to you a little about games. You know, A Song of Ice and Fire, the fantasy series I'm now writing, we have 4 books out, and I'm hoping to write 3 more to finish up the series, which is going to keep me busy for a few years. But Ice and Fire is actually more than just a series of novels. I've also been lucky enough to see it spin off into various other forms of entertainment. It's been made into a collectible card game from Fantasy Flight Games that's been very popular, and you can probably pick up a starter deck at the nearest game store if you have one in your vicinity, and learn to play that. It's also a board game if you're a fan of board games, as I am. There are several different versions of the board game actually out, also from Fantasy Flight Games. It's a role-playing game from Guardians of Order. Gigantic, beautiful book, full of art, full of information about the world of Westeros and the Seven Kingdoms. So even if you don't play the role-playing game, there's a wealth of information there in the world book. And if you do play the game, there are the rules and the statistics that allow you to have fun with a role-playing game. I have a miniatures game coming out from Testers, and 3 ranges of figures. The game will come with figures in the 25 to 30 millimeter scale, the small wargaming type figures, which you'll be able to paint up and play on a tabletop wargame with. And there will also be 54 millimeter figures. That's the old toy soldier scale, which is I collect myself. They're really too big to wargame with, but because of their size, they're beautiful figures. And the Ice and Fire 54 millimeter figures are being sculpted by Tom Meyer, who's one of the top sculptors in the world of gaming, and one of the first guys to really be making miniatures in the modern age, and he's doing an incredible job with those. So you can buy those as kits or as pre-assembled pewter things. And finally, we have a line of 1/18th scale resin miniatures coming out that are pre-painted, made in China. You don't have to paint those. You can just buy them home and buy them, bring them home, put them on the shelf as collector's items. And many of your favorite characters from the figures, Jon Snow, Dany and her dragons, Sandor Clegane, Jaime and Cersei, all of them will appear in these various forms of miniatures. I've also had the Hedge 9 comic books, talking to people about other kind of spin-off products, which you can find out about by following my website. I announce all the news there, so go to www.georgerrmartin.com, click on the news page, and you'll see the latest news about not only the Song of Ice and Fire books, but about all these various kinds of games and things like that. Now, one of the things that people ask me about these games is, how do you feel about them? Do you play them yourself? Why are you doing them? And I have to admit, when these offers first started coming in, I had kind of mixed feelings about them. A Song of Ice and Fire is a very ambitious work. I've been working on it for more than a decade. I regularly pour my heart and soul and lifeblood into this. If I am ever going to be remembered as a writer after I'm gone, it's probably going to be for this book, which is a magnum opus. I'm very serious about it. I mean, I do regard myself as a serious writer, although I'm working in the fields of science fiction and fantasy, which sometimes doesn't get the literary respect it should. But nonetheless, I'm doing a serious and ambitious work of fiction. And then there's these games and stuff that are coming out. And when I first started getting offers, I debated with myself, should I do these? Does it somehow impinge on the literary status of my book? I mean, F. Scott Fitzgerald never had Great Gatsby action figures, did he? But the more I thought about it, if they had action figures and one of them had approached F. Scott Fitzgerald, he probably would have sold Gatsby action figures because F. Scott Fitzgerald was always looking for money so he and Zelda could go out and party some more. But be that as it may, the truth is whatever reservations I had about these games was overwhelmed by the fact that down deep at heart, I'm a fan, and I love games. I love comic books. I grew up on all this stuff, and I still love all this stuff. I have a gaming group in Albuquerque. The very talented writer Walter John Williams and Melinda Snodgrass, John J. Miller, some of the folks who work for my Wildcard series, they're all part of the gaming group. I play role-playing games with them regularly, and I grew up with games. Of course, like a kid, I played Monopoly like everybody else. Later on, I got into Risk, which became almost an obsession with me for a while. I always win when I have the red pieces, usually start from Australia and battle my way up there. From Risk, I graduated to Diplomacy, which remains still one of the greatest board games ever. It takes, like 3 days to play it properly, so sometimes it's a little challenging, but the strategies and the interactions it creates are still terrific. And I think the Ice and Fire board game has some of the same flavor as Diplomacy, as well as a lot of other interesting twists and all that. And I'm very pleased with that because Diplomacy was one of my favorite games for many, many years. And then the big game for me, of course, was chess. I learned to play chess when I was still in grade school. Very quickly got to a state where I could, beat my father and my cousin Richie and the other people who had taught me how to play and beat the other kids at my school. Started buying books about it, learning the openings. I founded a chess club in high school, another chess club in college. I was the captain of the chess teams in both of those. And actually, after getting out of college, I played tournament chess, and I directed tournaments. I made my living by directing tournaments in the years after Bobby Fischer played Boris Spassky when America was crazy about chess for a brief period there. There were a lot of tournaments, and you could make a little money directing them, and that enabled me to pay my rent while I was writing my fiction on the side and selling just a few stories each year. So games are in my blood, and when I had the chance to see some of these Ice and Fire things translated to games, I was glad to do it. I've had some great partners. Fantasy Flight Games, in particular, has done a marvelous job with the collectible card game and the board game. Got some terrific artists. I love to seeing the versions that's done by these cards, to see my characters painted and come alive and respond to them. That's all very exciting. Sometimes, too, the games can actually inspire fiction. And for me, the big time that happened was with my Wildcard series, which is something I've been doing since the early 80s. It actually began in 1983 when a member at a local Albuquerque gaming group, Victor Milan, gave me a game called Super World for my birthday. And that was basically a superhero game. So I ran a superhero game for our group for a couple of years. And we had a terrific time playing it. And, 3/4 of our group were writers, science fiction and fantasy writers. And we came up with some wonderful characters, some very imaginative, fun characters. And we were playing 2-3 times a week, sometimes till 4 in the morning. And then we'd stay up until dawn just having a postmortem about the game we'd just played and how much fun it had been and some of the amusing things that had happened or the unexpected twists that had happened or the adventures we just had, the characters who had lived or died. Of course, it takes a lot of time to run a game like that. And so all these years passed, and I wasn't writing a whole hell of a lot. And finally, it occurred to me that, this isn't working here. It's fun, but no one is paying me to run this game. I got to figure out a way to make money out of all of this. And I did. With the help of Melinda Snodgrass, we decided to take some of our better Superworld characters and translate them to a shared world. And we came up with a science fiction rationale for it, and we called it Wild Cards. And we expanded. We started with the writers who had been part of the game group, Vic Milan, John J. Miller, Gail Gerstner Miller, Walter John Williams, Melinda, myself. But then we went rapidly beyond that, and we brought in other writers like Roger Zelazny, Howard Waldrop, Lou Shiner, Bud Simons, Steve Lay, terrific science fiction and fantasy writers, all of whom had some interest in comic books, in superheroes, or in games from all over the country. And together we created Wild Cards, and Bantam brought out the first Wild Card book in 1987, I believe it was, and the series was an immediate hit. And we're still going strong. 20 years later, there are 17 Wild Card books in print. 3 more have just been sold, and I'm now at work as editor on the 18th volume of Wild Cards, which is going to be Wild Cards: The Next Generation, since we'd realized that some of our original characters had gotten, kind of long in the tooth. It's hard to do much with a 60-year-old superhero. So we have some new kids coming in the new book, and we're working on that right now. It'll be out sometime in 2007, called Inside Straight. But Wild Cards is an indication of how, creativity can feed on itself. And sometimes, as with Ice and Fire, a work of fiction can inspire a game. And sometimes, as with Wild Cards, a game can inspire a work of fiction. It really doesn't matter what form you put it in. In some senses, it's all storytelling. It's all creativity, and it's all something that I enjoy. So I hope you do read my books. But if you are so inclined, go out and pick up some of these games too. I think you might enjoy them, and I certainly do. If you'd like to find out more about any of this stuff, please check out my website, www.georgerrmartin.com. And my latest novel, A Feast for Crows, is now on sale at a bookstore near you. So go out and grab a hold of a copy of that, too.